We started the first part of a three-part series that I'm doing here on Wednesday night since Steve's gone: the dream, the dungeon, and the redemption. And actually, if I find out Steve's not going to be here in 2 more Wednesdays, I might just take the redemption and make it a two-parts thing, because it's quite a bit of chapters to cover in 1 week. So I'll find out this next week, and then I'll figure out how quickly I'll run through those chapters. But it says, verse 1, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all he did to prosper his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in his house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?' So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, 'See, he has brought us into the Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened, when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside.' So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came into me to mock me. So it happened, as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside.' So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, 'Your servant did to me after this manner,' that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper." And let's pray. Lord, love this story. Love just what you've done through the life of Joseph and what we can learn from it tonight. God, I just pray for encouragement in our walks tonight. That is really why we come to the Word, is just to be spurred on to love and good works. Lord, we want come together as a fellowship to really embody those two things, and your Word is a great way to do that. It just kind of throttles us into the positions we're supposed to be at spiritually, and just taking action in the course of our life, trying to please you and do what's right by you, Lord. And your Word's just a really good resource, and it's something that is really effective in pointing out what we are doing wrong and correcting us, Lord, rebuking us and encouraging us, Lord, in righteousness. And so we just pray for that, God, you bless the study, and you just fill me with your Spirit, and as I speak these words, that they would just be edifying to the listeners, and we ask this in your name. Amen. So we started the story of Joseph last week, if you weren't here. It's beautiful, almost poetic in a way, because in this story, there's so many themes that, just kind of are intertwined. And of course, it's not just a story, it's the history of Joseph and God's special people, specifically Israel. Just to kind of recap, Abraham, who was the father of faith, who was called out of a pagan land, was the one who had a son by promise named Isaac. Isaac was the one who had two sons named Jacob and Esau, and Jacob would be the one that would eventually become the nation of Israel after much hardship and turmoil. But he's the one that God changes his name from thief to prince who has power with God, to Israel. And so he really turns his life around. It really embodies who he was before and after he met God. And, when you look through the story of Jacob, there's so many things to reconcile so many mistakes that this guy made. I mean, he had 12 sons. That's where the 12 tribes of Israel came from. But they were by 4 different women. 2 of them were his wives, I guess is the plural there, and 2 by his wife's maidservants. And they were kind of like surrogate women to have children with. And when you read that, you're like, is God like blessing this guy's sin? And I'll say this, the Bible's in no way condoning what's happening in Jacob's life. It's just relaying to us the reality of flawed people, dysfunctional people. We see God, actually, I would say that throughout the whole Old Testament using very flawed people, throughout the whole New Testament using very flawed people, continuing today in this church right now and here using flawed people. God continues to do that. And Jacob, he had the 12 sons, but he had a favorite son. And we talked about this last week. He had a favorite son named Joseph. And he was the son that he loved because the wife he actually loved, Rachel, was, this was his firstborn from her. And he openly showed favoritism. And I didn't talk about this much last week, but favoritism, the Bible actually forbids it. You're not supposed to have favoritism towards anyone based upon whether it's gender or color or actually the real passage of the Bible talks about affluence, how much money you have. James chapter 2, you don't give someone more attention or try to smooze them because they have something to give back to you. Like the Bible is so clear, we don't show favorites. That God doesn't show favorites. So we're to treat all men and all women equally. Well, Jacob did not obey that, and he definitely had a favorite son. He showed him his favoritism, actually gave him a many-colored coat, is what it says in the text, that basically showed to his brothers, I'm better than you. And I don't know if he wore it like that, but I wore this hat last week. I forgot to tell you guys this, in honor of Joseph's multicolored coat. It's the multicolored hat that I have. That's pretty cool. Joseph's brothers, because of that, also because of his dreams, we read this about the dream. He had these dreams, and one of the dreams, he's a stalk of wheat or barley, we don't know, but he's like a bundle of wheat, and all these other bundles of wheat bow down to him. And he tells his brothers this dream. He goes, I think that's you guys bowing down to me. And they're like, oh, really? Okay. And then he has another dream where the sun and the moon and the stars, 11 stars bow down to him. And he goes, that's mom and dad and all of you guys bowing down to me. And these dreams did not help his plight as far as his brothers were concerned. They did not like him more because of these dreams. And they quite despised him and saw opportunity to punish him. And so one day his father sends him out to go find his brothers. They're shepherds, so they're shepherding their sheep. He sends them out, hey, go find them, see how they're doing. Joseph goes, and on his way there, his brothers see him coming, and they plot to kill him. They get together and like, this is our opportunity. We'll murder our younger brother, and no one will be the wiser. And at that moment, the oldest brother, Reuben, steps in and goes, guys, I know we've all wanted to murder our siblings, right? We've all wanted, that thought has gone through our minds, but we can't actually do that thing. And so he calms him down. He says, instead, let's just throw him into a pit that will show this little punk and teach him a lesson. And so he gets them on board for that. They're like, okay, we won't kill him. We'll just throw him into a pit for a while and scare him a little bit and make him really feel pretty desperate and miserable. And so, I don't know, in the meantime, Reuben goes off to get a meal or something. We don't know where he's at, but while he's away, the rest of the brothers are eating dinner and they see a band of traders coming. And they're like, let's, instead of just, throwing Joseph into a pit to teach him a lesson, let's just sell him. I mean, we can make a profit off of him. And so they sell their brother as a slave to these band of raiders, these Ishmaelites, who then sell him, verse 1. It came to pass, verse 139, I was reading 40. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. So they sell their brother to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites then, in turn, make wise investment. They make a profit, I'm sure, off of Joseph, selling him to this captain of the guard named Potiphar. Now, that all, meanwhile, leaves their dad at home wondering what's happened to Joseph. So they bring his fancy coat back with some animal's blood on it, and the dad assumes that he's dead. The brothers don't say whether or not. They go, is this his coat? And the dad's like, this is surely his coat. He's surely been killed by an animal, and he's left to grieve for his favorite son. And that's the story where we left off last week, right? So chapter 39, verse 1, again, begins to tell us what happened to Joseph as he is making the most of an awful situation. It says again, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian, and his master saw the Lord was with him, and that he had made the Lord had made him all to do to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from that time that he made him overseer of his house, and that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except the bread which he ate. And Potiphar, there's a couple of things I want to share with you guys about him. His title, captain of the guard, probably was in relation to his position under Pharaoh, and it probably had to do with the fact that he was not just a prominent government official, he was probably like the Secret Service. You know, that term there, it likely has to do with the fact that he was the head of security for Pharaoh. So very trusted, someone that in that time would have been highly regarded. And yet for all his acumen and power, he reverts to Joseph's wisdom when it concerns his own household. So he goes away to work and he's like, I'm focused on Pharaoh. I'm focused on doing the business of the king. And at home, I've got someone who I trust so implicitly, so much that no matter what he does, it has my stamp of approval. And I don't even know what I own except for the bread that comes on my plate each night when I come to dinner. That's how, you can think of it as irresponsible, but really he saw Joseph as someone who was incredibly faithful, and I don't think it was irresponsible at all to put all this trust and all this stock into this man, because you see this over and over in Joseph's life as someone who is just incredibly blessed by God. And the real defining quality of Joseph is found in verse 2. Look at verse 2 again. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. This is the thing that distinguished him from everyone else, was the fact that God's favor rested on him. And Joseph used that blessing to care for and to watch over his master's goods in his household. He's like, God, help me to have wisdom concerning Potiphar. Help me have wisdom concerning his house, his goods, his land. I want you to give me a blessing so I can therefore bless Potiphar and his house. And Potiphar saw this. He saw God blessing Joseph, and he's like, I need some of that. I want what he has on me. To the point, again, where he didn't even know it was in his checking account. He's like, I don't even know where we bank. That's my wife, by the way. She's like, I have no idea which bank we use. And she's like, she's really made it clear. I need to put all my passwords somewhere, so if I pass away, she at least knows how to get money somewhere. And she's just so trustworthy of me. And that's exactly what's going on here with Joseph. Potiphar's house was so blessed. You might call this like collateral blessing. You've heard of collateral damage, right? When someone does something and it wasn't intended to hurt someone else. Well, this is collateral blessing. It wasn't necessarily intending to bless other people, but Joseph was just getting blessed by God so much that anyone in close proximity to him was getting the blessing of God as well. And I do see this, you guys, in believers' homes, in their houses, in their lives, like the people around them, whether it's their coworkers or just their family. Like, when you have someone who's faithful to the Lord, God is like pouring into them and just blessing them, not always just financially, but just in all kinds of ways, the joy and the peace of the household. My son, he's 20 years old, my oldest, his name is Israel, by the way. Not a coincidence? Well, of course, he got named after the guy in the Bible. So he moved out of our house about just over a year ago, because he's almost 20 years old at the time, and he's like, I'm going to go live with my cousin and two of my friends. And one of the things he said when he moved back, which was about 6 months later when the lease ran up and he was out of money, and he came back, but one of the things he said was, you know what, I miss the peace of our household. Like he could just feel it. There's a peace about our household. We weren't running around arguing all the time. We're not fighting. Our household is a household of peace because, again, we're centered on who God is and what he means to us, and that's a really important thing in our household, and because of that, there's a blessing that's associated with that. Now, from Joseph's point of view, he might not have seen the situation as blessed. Understand, Joseph, he feels abandoned. His brothers have betrayed him. He is a slave in someone else's house. And even though he's being blessed, none of it actually counts to his account. It's not like he's getting rich. I mean, he's being put in more and more authority, but really the blessing from his situation, maybe he feels like it's not much of a blessing. He's still a slave. His brothers, by the way, they're free. They get to sleep in their own bed. They get to do whatever they want. They're free men. But even, I would say this, you guys, just kind of thinking about this in reverse, even here and now in this situation, as Joseph is a slave, his brothers are free. I think it's in reverse. Because here's a guy who's serving the Lord in freedom. He's doing what God's called him to do. And he walks with, a confidence and an air of prosperity versus his brothers who are slaves to their guilt, probably to their shame. They probably wondered every day what happened to their brother. I wonder what happened to Joseph. And in that, just so much regret and shame would probably flooded them day by day by day. And so even though, again, sometimes the situation looks very dark, unfavorable, God is obviously at work. At the end of verse 6, which I didn't read, it says this: "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance." By the way, there's only 2 other dudes in the whole Bible that are called beautiful like this. David is one of them, and Absalom, his son, is the other one. And so it's a pretty big compliment. And this guy is very, very good looking. Moses was called beautiful when he was a baby, but that doesn't count. Babies can't really be that cute, right? There's a burden, though, you see, that comes with being beautiful. I don't know personally what that burden is like. I'm married to someone who carries that cross every day, though. So it says, verse 7, "Now it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?' So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her." Day by day, Joseph had a choice to be faithful, continue to be faithful to his master, to Potiphar, or to give in to this temptation. And this is incredible, you guys. This is intense. The one thing that his master hadn't given him, he literally gave him everything else, was his wife. And Joseph makes that point. You're the only thing he's held back from me. I can't take that. That's not mine. Now, it does help to have a little bit of cultural background of the time. The term, I didn't mention this in verse 1 because I wanted to mention it now, but the term in verse 1 where it says that he's an officer of Pharaoh, Potiphar's an officer of Pharaoh, that's a word that's defined as eunuch. And so in the ancient times, eunuchs, generally that term means they've been castrated. They can't have kids anymore. They can't even have sexual relations anymore. And so the idea that Potiphar is a eunuch, it could be literal. Now, what happened was over time when they would call officials eunuchs, it used to be that was just a title, and then over time it turned into the actual term that we use as eunuch today, or that's used historically, where you have people who can't have children anymore because they've been, again, some surgical procedure has been done on them. Well, we don't know if that was the case, but if it is the case, consider this. He's, in this household, he's a prominent figure, and understand the kings would make these guys eunuchs so that there was no competition. And this would be his, essentially a wife by appearance. She wasn't actually his wife. And so there could be that aspect where she is like, in a situation, in a relationship that it's not fulfilling sexually, and there's no intimacy there, and so she's like starving, and so she's coming after Joseph. The other thing that we know about in this time, historically speaking, is that the Egyptian culture, much like our own, is they did not regard the sexual union as something that is to be holy and consecrated. There were such moral or low moral standards on women specifically in that culture that it was assumed that wives would commit adultery. It wasn't something that was like profound or uncommon in that time, whereas even during Jesus' time, it was something that would have been very looked down upon. So what happens? Potiphar's wife cast, again, longing eyes on him. That's the word literally lifted up her eyes towards. She sees Joseph, and she, again, this is a beautiful dude. She's like, this is a stallion of a man, and I want him. I want to know him. And so she casts longing eyes, and she says, lie with me. Lie with me. And the assumption was that no one would know. There would be no consequences, that this would be equally beneficial to both parties. That this indiscretion wouldn't come to light and no one would be the wiser, which Joseph knew in his heart wasn't the truth. Just like Joseph's brothers knew that God still knew what was going on. Yet despite his refusal, she badgered him day after day after day. And talk about torment, you guys. Man, Joseph probably thought, when you think about like the pinnacle of the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life, he probably thought a lot of times about, man, as bad as this is, I remember when I was in that pit. That was awful. That pit was the worst. And now he's probably looking at this situation going, that pit was amazing. I wish I was back in that pit. As bad as this temptation was and as miserable as his life probably was at this point, being tempted day after day, she was probably a woman. We don't know this from the text because it doesn't mention her appearance, just Joseph's, but she was probably physically attractive. And again, there's no consequence. No one would be the wiser. And she's an authority in a sense over him, and she continues to badger him. And Joseph just goes, I can't do it. I refuse. I won't do it. I can't do this great wickedness is what he calls at the end of verse 9. And so she spoke to Joseph day by day, and he did not heed her to lie or hurt with her or to be with her even. He's like, I won't even be in the same room as you. This is not going to be good. And it goes on in verse 11, it says, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was when she saw that she had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant who you brought back to us came into me to mock me. So it has happened as I lifted my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside. And here's the proof of his attempt at raping me. Now imagine being Joseph in this situation. What does he get for his weeks, maybe months, maybe even years of faithfulness, of being tormented day after day after day? You'd expect accommodation. You'd expect like exaltation. Oh, Joseph, you did it. No, he gets an accusation. I told you last week, Joseph is a type or a picture of Christ, accused in absence of wrong. Accused in absence of wrong. For all his faithfulness, he is now the center of this scandal involving Potiphar's wife. Because when she finally caught him alone inside the house, she grabs him by the garment, and she's not going to force herself upon him, but she's trying to get him to lie down with her. And he's like, I'm out of here, chick. And like Usain Bolt hits the door and flees outside. Yet, she grabs onto his, it would be like an outer garment. It would be like he ran out, not naked, but in his underwears, essentially. Definitely, it would be a thing that he would be embarrassed by, but he was like, I'd rather be embarrassed than to be in this situation. She grabs his coat, outer coat, and he runs out. And then all the while, he ends up being accused of rape. And he took the only path we have in resistance to sin, which is full-fledged running away. And I'm going to come back to that thought at the end of the study, so keep that in mind. Here's a guy who's trying to be faithful. He was running away. He's doing his best to stay faithful to the Lord. So it was, verse 19. We'll finish the chapter. It says, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him his favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whenever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. Now, this looks like the worst possible outcome for Joseph, because he was being faithful for, and I'm going to let you know how long in a little bit, but he's been faithful for a long time. And at the end of that faithfulness, he gets accused and thrown into prison. I'll let you know, this is not the worst scenario for Joseph. It is very likely, we don't have the books and the laws necessarily of the Egyptians at this time exactly to know what was the case, but very likely the punishment should have been death for attempted rape. Joseph should have been put to the gallows. He should have been hung. And I think the reason that his punishment wasn't so was probably one of two reasons. One, that Potiphar knew his wife. He knew what kind of woman she was. And then secondly, I think he knew what kind of man that Joseph was. And I don't think he truly bought the story, but when you have someone make that kind of accusation with that kind of evidence, there's not a lot you can do against it. And I think part of the reason that Potiphar is angry is not just angry at Joseph, but the fact that he has his number two, the man who's been faithful over his whole house, who's blessed him so much, is now going away to prison. And I think he sends him to this prison specifically because he thinks he's going to be better taken care of. I don't know if that was the case. I kind of think the prison specifically made for the bad guys of Pharaoh was probably not a fun prison to be in, but no matter what prison you're in ancient times, it was probably not a picnic, if you will. But what does he do? What does Joseph do there? Talk about making lemonade out of lemons. Here's a guy who he does what Joseph does. He's faithful. He starts being faithful where he's at. And as a result, he's placed in authority over the whole prison. And now it says that the prisoner in charge, the keeper of the prison, committed everything to Joseph's command, just like Potiphar had done for his household. So now he's walking around, basically warden of the prison, and in charge much in the same way that he was in Potiphar's house, except now he's not only a slave, now he's a prisoner as well. And I think there's a bondage on a whole nother level there. And yet, it says, verse 21, the Lord was with him. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor, even in the worst of situations and circumstances. And again, for his faithfulness, he's being punished here. Yet the Lord was with him. In chapter 40, the story goes on, verse 1. It says, it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in prison, in the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. Now, if you're wondering if these characters kind of sound like maybe characters taken out of an episode of Downton Abbey or something, the chief butler and the baker, it's like, what should we get you, my lord? The term for butler here is also translated cupbearer. Now, this is a prestigious office in ancient times. Whether you're talking about Egyptian or, the Assyrians or whatever, there's a point where Nehemiah is described as this same kind of position. And basically, his job as the cupbearer of the king was to ensure that the king's food wasn't poisoned. He's kind of like the canary that goes into the mines to make sure there's not a gas leak. You guys have heard of these, right? And back in the day when they were doing mining in different places, they would bring canaries in cages. And if the canary was dead, they're like, oh, we should probably get out of here. They were realizing they're probably huffing a lot of gas, and so the canary would die first. That's what the cupbearer was for the king. He would taste death before the king would. Jesus, by the way, is described as a cupbearer for us in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews. So he's the cupbearer. This was a job that was not just important. It was given to someone who's very trusted and trustworthy, because you can't have someone who's lying to you about whether or not your food's being poisoned. And I know this seems crazy. Imagine living in times where you had legitimate concern about food poisoning. And I'm not talking about like eating taco truck or something and having a stomach ache. I'm talking like legit iocane powder. I'm talking about, this is what's going to actually poison you. So you had to make sure that the king he survived. This was, again, a trusted office. So was the job of the baker, the chief baker, the confectioner, the one who made the food for the king. Now, that job may seem equally important, maybe more important, depending on how good of a chef he was. And so he would make the food the king ate. Obviously, he had to be trusted not to kill the king, because that was something that happened all the time in those times. People were trying to put themselves in places of power. But he also had the job of making sure the king liked the food. It had to taste good. Now, for some undisclosed reason, we don't know why, the Pharaoh was angry, verse 2, with these two officers. So he throws them into jail. We don't know the circumstances. We don't know the backstory at all. It might have had to do with something with conspiracy. Pharaoh heard some rumors that people were plotting against him, and the two most obvious candidates that would come against him would be his baker and his cupbearer. These would be the ones, again, who had to be trusted the most as well. So he's like, well, I don't know what to do. Let's just throw them in prison until we have these things figured out. And so, again, in the first 4 verses, you have these guys put under actually the authority of Joseph, and Joseph serves them while they're under his care. In verse 5, it says, then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of the Lord's house, saying, why do you look sad today? And they said to him, we each have had a dream, and there is no interpretation of it. Now, these guys they have dreams. They don't really know what's going on. If you've ever had a dream that you thought maybe was from the Lord, and you're like, I really don't know what this dream means, it can really mess with you and kind of leave you in a place like, Lord, is this you? And they're not even in terms of this is from God. They just think it's probably the gods, plural, speaking to them in some regard, but they don't know what these dreams mean. And so the next day, they're sulking around the prison, and whatever that looks like. They're walking around feeling sad for themselves, and not just because they're in jail, because I think most people would probably wear a sad face if they're in jail, but Joseph sees something different. He's like, what are you guys bummed out about today? And I don't know if it was me in charge of the prisoners and I saw a bunch of sad faces, I might just move on. But Joseph really cared for these guys. He cared for their mental welfare, if you will. He asked, why the sad countenance? And they explained that they've each had a dream. And Joseph responds, well, the interpretation of that dream belongs to the Lord. And some reoccurring themes. I told you this story, like it weaves in and out of what's gone on already in a way that's almost poetic. Remember, it was his coat, Joseph's coat, that got him in trouble with his brothers, and his dreams that got him in trouble with his brothers. And now it's his garment that he flees that got him in further trouble into prison. And now these guys have more dreams that are in need of interpretation, just like his dreams were. So the two dreams again. And so the first dream, verse 9, it says, the chief butler told his dream to Joseph, and he said to him, behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded. It blossomed, shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner, when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed, I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. So this first dream the butler has is of a vine. 3 branches grow off of it. They all bud. And then he grabs some clusters of grapes off those branches, squeezes them into the cup of Pharaoh, and then gives the cup to Pharaoh. And he's like, I don't know what this dream means. It seems like it could be bad or good. I'm not sure what's going on. And the interpretation obviously is 3 days that he says here. And in 3 days, you're going to be restored. You're going to be the king's cupbearer once more. You're going to have your former job back. And the only thing Joseph asks, for doing this, I'm doing this for free. I'll interpret your dream. The only thing I ask is that you remember me When you're back in the Pharaoh's palace, remember that it was me who interpreted this dream for you. Just, can you do that me a favor? Do me that solid for me, because I'm not here for any thing I've done wrong. I'm actually, I'm in here for a false accusation. The second guy, verse 19, it says, when the chief baker saw the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered, and by the way, at that point you're like, well, that seems like it could be good or bad. I'm not really sure what's going on. Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you from a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. There's your interpretation. Not good. Talk about your all-time backfire. He's like, this sounds like a good thing. I'm going to go ahead and interpret my dream for me. And Joseph gives him the absolute worst interpretation you can imagine. That at the end of 3 days, Pharaoh's going to have his head, the birds are going to eat his flesh, and how quickly that it turned on the baker's, on his destiny, if you will. Verse 20 says, now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cupbearer in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So 3 days later, which also, by the way, is Pharaoh's birthday. I can't believe we almost forgot. That was embarrassing. This comes to pass. The butler is restored. The baker is hung out on the gallows, just as Joseph foretold, which you would assume you meant Joseph was going to be set free, or at least given some kind of credit that he deserves, because that's literally all he asked for. He's like, just remember me, like maybe just throw me a bone, for doing you this solid. And no doubt the baker, was about to celebrate. He's thinking in my mind, like, now that he's free, the baker's going to come celebrate my prophetic gift. The baker's not going to. He's not excited, but the butler should have surely said something on Joseph's behalf. And I think Joseph learned, like many do who serve and do the right thing all the time, doesn't mean you always get the credit for that. In fact, the whole story of Joseph is doing the right thing no matter the consequence, and sometimes not just not getting credit, but sometimes being punished for doing the right thing. And Joseph, again, is left in prison. He's forgotten, at least seemingly for a time, until chapter 41, which is where we'll pick up the story next week. Now, I have a few things for you guys, just going back through these chapters, thinking how these things apply to us. There's very clear principles here, things that will help us in our own walks. And so I wrote down a handful. If you do take notes, you can write these things down. Number 1 is you can go anywhere with God. You can go anywhere, literally anywhere with God. I know this is a theme I would say is pretty common in our Christian culture. In the context, we usually mean like, we could go with God. Like, we can do great things for him. Like, we're going to achieve awesome things in winning the world to Jesus. And we can go anywhere and do anything because God is with us. And if God is for us, who can be against us? And we have like a celebratory attitude when we consider that context. And that's all true. God can do great things in us and through us, and all the things we do for him can be for his glory. It's awesome. Now, in Joseph's context, this means an entirely different thing. God was with him when he was in the pit. You can go to the pit. God is going to be there with you. When you're sold as a slave, or when he was sold as a slave, God was there. When he was serving in Potiphar's house, when he was being tempted in Potiphar's house, God was there too. While he was enduring false accusations and being put in prison, God was there. See, God wasn't just helping him serve him when things were easy. We see God was with Joseph in the hardest seasons of his life. And you guys know this, we believe that God works most intently in the seasons that are most difficult in our lives. It was David who said that it's in the valley of the shadow. What's there? The Lord, he is with us. We don't have to fear because God is with us in those times. He's not only comforting us, which he does, but he's given us the endurance to go through those seasons. But he's also in the midst of the work that we're doing. You guys have heard that, the fruit grows in the valleys. Like the work has to be done. You don't have vineyards on top of mountains. Nothing grows up there. It's fun to be on top of a mountain. Don't get me wrong. I love, going to high places and seeing things. It's pretty exciting. It's fun. But that's not where the work is done. That's the work, as grueling as it can be when there's no credit, when there's no reward, when there's no encouragement, there's no pat on the back. God is there working in us and through us, sustaining us, even lifting us up when we fail. I'm reminded of the response the Sanhedrin had to the disciples, in Acts chapter 4. Here's these guys who are going out passionately preaching Jesus. They're just going out doing the things they felt inspired by the Holy Spirit without any regard to the consequence of their own reputation. And it says this in verse 13, "Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, they perceived they were uneducated and untrained men. They marveled, and they realized they had been with Jesus." They didn't need education. They didn't need training. They didn't need a formal school. The thing that distinguished them from the rest of the world, if you will, was the fact that God was with them. They had been with Jesus. All they needed was proximity to their Lord. You guys, nothing has changed for us. Nothing changes now. If we want to have the kind of endurance, the kind of walk that will endure hardships and storms and all the failures of those around us, we have to be close to the Lord. And I know maybe some of you guys have been asking that question to the Lord, like in your season of suffering. God, why are you allowing me to go through this right now? And I'll say this, you don't need answers because you actually have what you need today. Today, you just need him. He's there in the dungeon as well. He'll be with you no matter what. And what you need today is him. You need his presence. That's what Joseph had. And everywhere he went, again, verse 2 of chapter 39, the Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. He walked with him. He blessed Joseph even in seasons when he felt like the blessing didn't matter. He didn't deserve it. Right? Verse 21, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor. The Lord was with him. You can go anywhere with God. Literally, you can go anywhere. And as long as God is there, that's what is important in the midst of what's going on. The second thing I want to pull from this to you guys, I think is so important for us, is there is a blessing in the serving. That's one of the themes of Joseph's life is his service towards others. Rather, for me, in that situation, just being betrayed by my family, the people who should love me the most, and now I'm serving as a slave in someone heathen's household. That's what he would consider Potiphar, some godless heathen. I'm serving in this house. It would be so hard not to be bitter and angry and just bent out of shape like no other. And just, going, why am I here? And just, the work that I do, I'm going to do the absolute bare minimum. Because this guy doesn't deserve this. I don't deserve this. And it would have been easy for Joseph to do that. We'll do what we often do in those situations. Complain and moan and grumble. God, Lord, why would you do this to me? I'm such a good-looking guy. And think little, here's Joseph thinking little of his present position, his present awful position. He was a slave, but rather he thought of just serving others. He was so caught up in service, whether in Potiphar's house it was to his master or in the prison even to the keeper of the prisoner. It's like this is the guy who just wanted to serve. He believed that God could bless him right where he was. Sometimes we think for God, in order for him to bless us, we have to be in the right situation. Like we need to be X, Y, Z, whatever, fill in the blank. We need to have this and this needs to be, and then once I have that, or I'm in this place, or this job has come, or this circumstance is, worked out, or this family situation is jailed, whatever it is, then I can be blessed. And Joseph was like, no matter where I'm at, God can bless me right here. And he really embodied, you guys, the theme and the call of Jesus and the kingdom of God in the New Testament. Because again, as a type of Jesus, Joseph lived to serve others. Even when they didn't deserve it. And I would say again, most of the people Joseph served, they didn't deserve his service. It's like, why does Jesus call us to a life of service as Christians? Like, why is that the call, you guys? It's because that is the only way to truly thrive. Like, not just survive, not just live, but that's the way that God has ordained things. He's created things so we would thrive as human beings when we live to serve others. You know, people who focus all their time on being happy, on being content, or loving themselves, as the philosophy of the world is right now, you notice those people are never happy. They're never content, and they hate themselves. Like, what is the theme here? Well, what I see is a lot of people trying to serve themselves. Well, I got to focus on me before I can focus on anyone else. You hear that nonsense, right? I got to love me before I can love you. You know, the problem is you love yourself too much. The person you love the most is miserable, and so you're miserable. And people who focus their time on being happy and content, loving themselves, they're none of those things. And people who pour out their lives for others' sake, again and again and again, they find the truth as Jesus spoke in Matthew 16:25. He says, whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. That's the losing and finding Jesus is talking about. He's talking about living your life for others, giving your life for others. I know this is overly simple, but I honestly think there's not better advice to a lot of people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, with fear. You know, we have people who come in for counseling all the time, and they have all these issues, and honestly, the best advice I can give most people in that situation is you need to serve. You know, I tell my kids this, my older boys, we adopted them when they came into our house when they were 8 and 11, and we adopted them when they were about 10 and 12, 13. And, you know, there's a lot of baggage, emotional, detachment stuff. And, you know, they know just growing up in our house that we would never let that thing be the thing that get to focus their life on. We don't get to sit here and feel sorry for ourselves. We don't get to sit here and think about all these emotional traumas we've had. What good does that do? It's like, well, I got to work through these things. No. Actually, we have these folders that the DHSH gave us when we got the boys, and there was just a folder like this thick on each kid and all the things that happened to them. They documented all this trauma, and we've never opened them. I think we might have even thrown them away at some point. It's like, that's their past. We don't need to focus and dwell on things. Those aren't what define us. And we, you know, our encouragement always to them, even to our little ones now, we have a 5 and a 7-year-old as well, but we're focused on what we can do today to serve others. As you continue to focus on yourself, you're going to continue to grow bitter and be miserable. When you serve, when you pour out your life, and then when you're even empty in that regard, and you pour out a little bit more, God blesses you. He fills you. And you're filled with this Holy Spirit. You know, you hear about burnout in ministry. There's no burnout when the Holy Spirit is involved, because there's a controlled burn. It's like he's not going to burn you out. There's a fire that he sustains you with that gives you the strength that you need. And maybe the strength isn't enough for tomorrow, but it's enough for the day, amen? Like the sufficient is his strength for the day, and that's the story that God is telling through Joseph's life, is he commits his life to the Lord. The Lord was with him, and the Lord blessed him no matter what he did in his service. And Joseph, in that regard, no matter what he went through, was unfazed by those things. He continued to serve the Lord in those things. Number 3. This is probably the most helpful. Run, don't walk from temptation. Run from temptation. That was the story of Joseph in chapter 39, right? He got caught in a situation. He had to run. You know, we're driving through Canyon Lakes just a couple days ago on the way home from a friend's house. And my 7-year-old son, Judah, says, Dad, we're just driving by the golf course. He goes, Dad, golf is kind of like temptation. I'm like, okay, follow me here. He goes, if you're trying to go in a certain direction, Satan, he's like the wind who's trying to knock your ball into the sand trap. I'm like, and then he says this, and when you get your ball in the hole, it's like you did something good for someone. I'm like, all right, this kid, I don't think he realizes how profound he is right now, but I'm never going to view the golf the same when I play it again. And clearly, Satan is very involved in my golf game, is all I will say. Joseph gives us such a clear example of how to endure and how to respond to temptation. You know, never give in, no matter what, no matter how hard or how long the temptation is, run. You know, the first part, remember, Joseph was motivated by watching, by the fact that God was watching, rather. The fact that God was there. He refused to give into his master's wife. And in the end of verse 9, he says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph knew the reality that even if no one else was watching, because that's what she was essentially alluring him with, is no one will know. You can come lie with me. No one will ever find out. It's just between you and me. There's no consequences. Joseph knew that if no one else was watching, God was watching. And the problem with our view towards sin is often we think it's not going to affect anyone. No one's ever going to find out about it. There's no consequences, so why does it matter? I'm reminded of the story of Moses in chapter 2 of Exodus. It was when he was full grown. He was still in the palace of Pharaoh at that time. It says, now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. If you know the rest of the story of Moses, that ends up being the thing that drives him into the wilderness for 40 years of his life. But the problem is Moses looks right, he looks left, but he doesn't look up, right? He doesn't realize that God is there watching him. You're never alone. That's the thing we can't forget. We're never alone. God's with us everywhere we go. And so we got to keep that in mind. Joseph understood that. He's like, in this temptation, in this sin, I know the Lord is always there. Keep that on the forefront of your mind. That helps in the battle of temptation because you realize, you know what? God, I'm accountable. No matter where I'm at, I'm accountable to you. The second thing we can take away from Joseph's resistance to temptation is Joseph's reasoning is that he would not take this one thing from his master because his master had given him everything else. You follow that? He's like, this is the only thing he told me I can't have. I can have everything else. I don't want to lose everything else for this one thing. And I think that's a great way to look at sin in general, as a fleeting pleasure, a momentary thing that God has so much better, so much greater for you. A lot of times when we talk about sin, we talk about consequences, especially when we're relaying these things to youth. Well, you don't want to do drugs because your brain will look like a fried egg. Or don't smoke because the Surgeon General says it may cause cancer, and we have these consequences. Sex outside of marriage, you're going to have a baby, you're going to have STDs, and we have all these consequences. And I think the thing that probably is most motivating for a believer, and what I found in my own personal walk, is not looking at what I am going to be punished by, but what I'm going to miss out on as a believer if I give in to these momentary pleasures. Like Joseph's father, Jacob, who once tempted his brother Esau, it says, for a morsel of bread, for a bowl of beans. Esau traded away. In Hebrews 12:16, it says, make sure no one is immoral or godless like Esau, who traded away his birthright as a firstborn son for a single meal. And I won't give you the whole story context, but he gave up a huge spiritual blessing for a momentary pleasure. And trust me when I say this, you don't want what Satan's got in his crock pot, okay? It's not good. The third thing we see from Joseph is when all else fails, just run. Like Forrest Gump, run, fast, flee, escape, whatever you have to do. 2 Timothy 2:22 says, flee also youthful lust. Notice he doesn't say flee you youth from lust. It's youthful lust. These are things that would more obviously trip us up when we're younger, but they don't mean that they go away when you're older. But pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. As Martin Luther once said, you can't stop birds from flying over your head, but you can't stop them from building a nest in your hair. And so, when I think of temptation, it's like you don't sit there and entertain thoughts. You don't dwell on things, whether it's, again, tempestuous thoughts, or you don't go to places or look at things that are going to arouse you. The thing that Joseph did is he refused to not just, be with this woman, but to be in her presence alone. And he didn't want that to happen because he knew there would be a temptation there. And thoughts, you guys, this is from James chapter 1. Thoughts are the seeds which grow into full-blown sin and rebellion. We begin to entertain thoughts. We begin to think, well, it's really not that bad. And we think, well, there's really no consequences. And we make excuses. And it's after a while that thought turns into full-blown sin, and which brings forth death. And so how do we deal with sin? We flee. Jesus talked about cutting off your right hand, plucking your eye out. These are just drastic measures that we're to take as believers to be faithful to the Lord. And Joseph, for him, it meant giving away his dignity, fleeing out, in his undies, going, I don't care what people think of me as long as I'm faithful to the Lord. And sometimes when we talk about fleeing from temptation, it means literally fleeing, like getting out of the situation you're in, the place that you're at, running away. Chucking the phone or, throwing the computer in the garbage, whatever it is, like doing that radical thing. But sometimes, again, it's in our heart. We have to run away from those things. In 1 Corinthians 10:13, you guys are familiar with the verse. It says, no temptation is overtaking you such as common to man. Meaning that whatever we're dealing with, I know a lot of times we think our sin is unique to us. We're the only ones who are suffering. It's not true. Your sin is not unique to you. Everyone struggles. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it. And so what you want to do is when you have that way of escape, to take it, to run. And when you fail, to pick yourself up and ask forgiveness and move forward. And again, Joseph just gives us a great picture of how to endure temptation, how to battle the flesh. Last thing, and we'll close it with this. The best things take time. The best things take time. I want to do some reverse time engineering because we know from Genesis 37:2 that Joseph was 17 years old when he became a slave. So he was sold as a slave when he was 17 years old. We know from Genesis 41:46 that he was 30 when he was promoted in Pharaoh's household. We're going to find that out. I just spoil alert. Dang it. In chapter 41, he's promoted to Pharaoh's household when he's 30 years old. And we know that he was in prison for 2 years in chapter 41, verse 1. So that means that he was a slave in Potiphar's house for 11 years. 11 years. That's why I said it wasn't just maybe weeks or months. It could have been years that Potiphar's wife was antagonizing him, was making his life miserable. And, he probably thought, having come to the pinnacle of success in that household, being the most trusted official, he's the number 2 man to one of the most important men in the nation. He's probably thinking, this is a pretty good place for a slave to be. I mean, I've turned my life around as much as I can. Yet for all that, he ends up in jail. He ends up a prisoner about 2 years for a crime that he didn't commit. And then you guys know, if you read the end of the story, how this all sets up events for God to work and God to save not just Joseph, but not just his family, but the entire nation. Not just of Egypt, but the surrounding nations around Egypt. God was using these events to save a massive amount of people. And the timing of this entire narrative was played out precisely the way that God intended. Even the butler forgetting Joseph, going back to the palace and forgetting to give Joseph credit, was part of God's plan. Now, it's hard to imagine in the midst of those long, hard years, again, Joseph, it says that God was with him everywhere, but he probably felt forgotten by God a lot of times, for all that Joseph's going through, yet he's continued described as the one that the Lord is with. In Joseph's story, it took a long time to develop, and I would say like the best things in life do sometimes. It takes time. That same son, my son Judith, was telling me the other day, he's like, Dad, he spouts off these scientific facts at me. And he goes, Dad, did you know like a fly only lives for 24 hours? I was like, wow, I did not know that. That is not the truth, by the way. Sometimes he says things with such confidence, I just take it on face value. I went and looked that one up. It's not even close. But he does have a lot of good scientific knowledge thanks to this show called Wildcrats. And so he's a big fan of that show. And I was thinking about that, though. There are a lot of things that have a very short lifespan, things that don't last very long. You can grow a squash, for example, almost overnight. I don't know if you knew that. But in the end, all you have is a squash. So it's like, big deal, right? A mighty oak tree, which grows from like this small acorn, it can take decades for it to grow. Hundreds of years even for it to grow fully. Compared to animals, humans, and if you guys knew this, humans have the longest development both in and out of the womb. We have the longest almost for birth, but developmental-wise, as far as us being fully mature adults, They say that the full frontal lobe of the brain isn't fully developed until you're about 25 years old. And I can testify to that. You know, car insurance won't let you have your own, they won't let you rent a car until you're 25 years old. We let people vote when they're 18. I'm just saying, someone's got to figure it out here. And I'll say this, what I've learned in my years of serving the Lord, and no matter what context it is, whatever I've been waiting for, it has always been worth the wait. Are you talking about the context of marriage? You know, I was married pretty young. I was married when I was 21 years old. But I, for a full year, dedicated my walk to the Lord and was not even seeking a spouse. I was like, God, I just want to seek you. And now hindsight doesn't seem very long to me. I'll tell you, to a 20-year-old, it felt like a long time. Like 20 years, this is going to be forever. It was so worth the wait. I'm thinking about kids. My wife and I had 10 years before we had kids. And, we always told people we're on the 5-year plan. That was just to shut them down when we got married, because that's the first question you get when you get married. Right? When you're dating, they're like, when are you going to get married? And when you're married, they're like, when are you going to have kids? We're like, 5-year plan. All right, back off. After a while, though, that 5-year plan turned into like the 7-year plan, and then people stopped asking because it's awkward. And so God finally gave us some kids, and in that I see the blessing and the waiting in a lot of these things. And I would just say this, Joseph, in the midst of his learning this lesson, he's going to one day look back with this word we use called hindsight. You can't get hindsight until you've already gone through it. He doesn't understand this until you're past it. And you don't know what you're in the midst of tonight. I don't know what you're going through, and you're in the middle of it. But know this, there's hindsight coming. You're going to be able to look back and see what God was developing, what he was trying to accomplish in your life. And if it feels like it's taking too long from your perspective, it probably just means it's going to be all the more worth it. That the good things in life are worth waiting for. And in that context, again, we see this in Joseph's life. Here's a guy who waited. He was faithful. And for years and years and years, God was working to unfold this beautiful story of redemption, which is where we'll pick up next week. Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word. Just thank you for the story of Joseph and what it means to us, Lord, as believers, that we get to walk in stories like this. We get to see you be faithful in the valley. We get to see you be faithful in the hardships and the difficult seasons of life, Lord. And God, really, it's for your glory. It's not just so we could come out victorious and be happy and have celebratory victory dances or something, God. It's so you can get glory, so we can point to you, Lord. We can bring this world to you, because that's what they need. They don't need a bunch of Christians walking around all happy. The world needs you. And God, we want to ask tonight, Lord, I don't know who is going through what. I do know that if we're not in a trial currently, we're probably about to be in one, or we just got out of one. And so, God, in that regard, Lord, we know that we need your faithfulness. God, we need you to help us to be faithful to you, to give us the strength that we need to endure and to walk faithfully, Lord, in these hard times. Lord, help us to focus our eyes on you and to know that you're always there with us. And God, just to be reminded of the importance of sanctification, of following you closely, not letting little sins crowd or choke out the word in our life. But we would just be men and women who are seeking you and seeking your presence in our life and desiring to be more like you each day. And when we fail, Lord, that there would just be forgiveness there would be mercy, and we would be receiving of those things. And so, Lord, I just pray for your people tonight. Pray you be with them this week. Encourage them in their walks, and we ask this in your name. Amen. God bless you guys.